We've come to the fourth episode of It's a Sin, Russell T Davies' 2021 drama about the AIDS epidemic in 1980s London. The bulk of our discussion will be on this fourth episode, set in 1988, but at the end of the discussion we'll have a clear transition and then a little Sin spoiler zone, where we have a brief discussion about episode 4 in context of, and with spoilers for, all episodes of the series. But discussing episode 4 today will be myself, Neo from Australia, joined by Ingiga from England and Tomtit from Australia. What did you guys think of this fourth episode?
I really loved this episode. To me, it felt like a very different sort of episode. It had this quality of like, at the risk of sounding like a complete stewed, it was a bit like sort of Joseph Campbell-ish, because you have these twin narratives of Richie and Roscoe sort of facing their demons and like going back to sort of their childhood in Richie's case and into the corridors of power with Roscoe's case. It was sort of like weirdly spiritual. I mean, Roscoe literally calls Parliament the depths of hell, or whatever words he used. And it was very like, yeah, cinematic, I guess, is a word I would use. I really like that quality about it.
Indeed. Gig, what did you think?
I felt Richie's whole progression and development in this episode was really fascinating. I found particularly his whole, his personal descent into hell, as in going back to his childhood home and stuff, I felt was absolutely fascinating. I felt you got some of the most really interesting writing from RTD of the series so far. So yeah, it was really compelling.
Obviously, at some point, we're going to circle around to the big salient promoted part of the episode, the Daleks, the Doctor Who elements. But yeah, first, let's talk about Richie. Something with Richie I found really interesting was, of course, at the end of episode 3, he doesn't get the HIV test. But in this episode, something really interesting psychologically with him is going on. It's that he refuses to take the test, but he does basically everything else in his power to try and address possible HIV within him. If he doesn't know for sure, it's like he needs that kind of comfort of ambiguity. So he's doing all these crazy health routines. He even considers imbibing battery acid. He's always on this phone line about HIV help, about what can I do? Can I do this? Can I do that? Will this work? Is there a way I can stop this from happening? I think it was interesting how we went from this dismissal of all these conspiracies, or this creation of conspiracies rather, in episode 2, where he's talking about, oh, HIV can't be real because so-and-so, I'm so smart. Whereas in this one, he's almost like obsessing over possibilities to fix it, and he's like trying to outsmart it in that way. I thought that was a really interesting evolution. And just that desperation in him, I can't know for sure if I have it, I refuse to know for sure, but I'm going to do everything else to address the possible HIV within me. I found that really interesting. What did you guys think of Richie's mindset there?
It's interesting that he was the one doing all the sort of crank nonsense this time, like, drinking the battery acid, eating raw eggs, a bit of a Watchmen moment there, and like, and doing all these things that obviously we still see people do today, like drink hydroxychloroquine to cure COVID or whatever, the complete ridiculousness of all these things. I think it's interesting how just the sheer, the desperation has sort of led him to do this kind of irrational, this mysticism, all these voodoo cures, like this sort of nonsense. I think it really shows how this idea of him as this so smart, so rational one completely flipped in on itself and sort of broken down. It's really interesting.
There's a running theme of Richie sort of like refusing to show any kind of weakness whatsoever. And I mean, it's there like when he's at the table with Jill and her parents and he completely shuts down any even mention of HIV, which to my mind was probably his most unlikable moment in the entire series. I was like, that's such a rude thing to say. But his refusal to show weakness, and that's what makes the sort of climactic moment of him doing the ballet so effective, I thought, because it has this whole build-up that was sort of a culmination of his whole character. That was an amazing moment. But yeah, it was an incredible showcase for Richie.
Richie's outburst there you're talking about, the one with the two Jills, our real Jill playing our fictional Jill's mother, I found that really interesting and compelling, where he's like crying against how every conversation has to be about AIDS in the households. I know Russell T Davies and Ollie Alexander have talked about that kind of innate connection of being gay with HIV, how that's such a struggle, for in the 1980s, especially, for that to be so connected constantly.
I always connected HIV and AIDS with being gay, and I've tried to figure out where that came from.
It's so hard to describe. This is why I wrote this, because this Strange Days, but it's the only childhood I knew. It's the only growing up I ever knew. I didn't know any other. So it also seems kind of normal to me. I mean, for you, it's like you're growing up and you're coming out to yourself and then to your family. It's like, at what time did a virus enter your thinking? When did that become part of the same thing? And bear in mind, no internet, no nothing. It's I look back and I can't think where we got our information from. We get a little paragraph in the paper and something in a gay magazine, except you were much more interested in turning the page in the gay magazine to see the naked boy on the next page and not reading that bit about people dying. So it was strange. Very much aware I wasn't in the kind of storm. I never lived in London. I think, the bigger the city, the bigger things happen. So I kind of avoided it a lot. And but my friends started to, there were illnesses and people started disappearing and strange days.
Richie sort of shutting down that conversation. It's like, if he had said, look, guys, I don't want to talk about this, like, it's really affecting me, that would have been absolutely fine and justifiable. Like, of course, it would be understandable. But again, it's that refusal to show weakness. And the words he uses are, the worst thing about AIDS is that it's the subject of every conversation. And it's like, no, I don't think that's the worst thing about AIDS. It's like when like a celebrity comes out with some heinous crimes and someone like Patton Oswalt on Twitter goes on the record to say, oh, the worst thing about Bill Cosby is the hypocrisy. It's like, no, it was the crimes. And that sort of statement really betrays sort of like such a sort of solipsism and privilege. And that to a certain extent is Richie. It's like, and I think you see that in Richie's household as well. Like even his sister, how she's constantly resentful that like everything is about Richie now. It's like that whole family has sort of a narcissistic streak, which is quite fascinating.
See, I think even the reasoning that Richie uses when he shut down the conversation, like, oh, every conversation is about AIDS. Like, obviously, that's not true. We literally see them having conversations about other things in the episode. It's just he's doing that kind of self-victimizing sort of exaggeration thing.
Like he's thinking of something that's not there.
Well, it's because he, deep down, I think he's aware, at least he thinks deep down, he probably does have it, that it's always present on his mind, which is why he projects this out. Like, other people might be talking about other things, but his brain is only going to remember when people talk about HIV, since that's what's stressing him all the time. And he thinks back to, the times he had before this came to the zenith that is now. Those parties and things, like he was doing in episode 2, Davies has described this kind of thing of, these very wild parties, gay men would have together as being, it's not just about who you're boozing with, it's not just about who you're sleeping with, it's about being free, it's about being open and gay or whatever sexuality you were, finding yourself and being absolutely open and loud about it. So it was actually very important. The parties were the least important thing and the life being lived was much more vital. I think because Richie felt so, for whatever reason, Richie felt so repressed on the Isle of Wight, which he of course returns to in this episode, that he felt London was going to be, like this golden city of freedom for him, and to have this complete unfairness of a virus crash down on that. Of course, it's not the worst thing that his life is inhibited by this and that he can't talk about other things as much, but it is something I think you can see why this is tormenting him so much. Of course, the worst thing is all the afflicted that are dying.
So while we're on the note of Richie's kind of contradictions and maybe hypocrisies and dishonesties and things like that, there's a kind of running theme in this episode where even at the funeral, for example, he's sort of making excuses for the homophobic family and stuff and saying, well, you shouldn't have caused a fuss at the funeral, they're just grieving, be nice to them. And then later on, he's like, well, you shouldn't write a children's book about gay people. We really see how that, you could call it, I don't want to go as far as saying internalised homophobia, but that sort of, that desire to integrate with the mainstream and not rock the boat, so to speak, rock the boat of the straight society is really recurrent with Richie.
Richie being a Tory voter connects to this kind of thing, of course. Davies has said how at one point Richie says he's a Tory voter, but they did exist. They existed then and they exist now. There's a lot of Tory gays. It's very easy to write an 80s drama where Thatcher is the enemy, and I had an enormous laugh with Thatcher in the show. But I also thought it was important to have someone in there who said that he voted for her. I think, again, it's something very interesting psychologically going on with Richie there, whether you want to characterize it adjacent to internalized homophobia like Gig was talking about. I think another thing that feels relevant here to me is when Richie's in the bar at the Isle of Wight and he has that little talk where he says, oh, the quiet, repressed girls, in school, they never learn how to conduct themselves socially properly. So when they leave school, they get super drunk and they get super wild and they cause all sorts of troubles because they were super repressed, and then they just explode out. I feel like Richie comes back to this idea of repression a lot. I thought that was perhaps another interesting reflection on himself.
Yeah, he may as well have been talking about himself there, mightn't he? And actually, what really fascinated me with this idea of sort of childhood repression and stuff is that when Richie has that big confessional verbal diarrhea to his straight childhood friend on the Isle of Wight, and what that put me in mind of was how this is something that I think maybe a lot of gay people can perhaps relate to, this idea of being slightly hung up on stuff from school. Because I think when you're growing up as a child and you spend your youth perhaps hiding things, and things like desire are this object of shame or secrecy, and you're not actually living as yourself, you don't know how to articulate these feelings. I think it maybe warps you to a degree. Like, I mean, certainly I can relate as well. This idea of having all this life that you couldn't quite have, and things that were so like unattainable and unreachable when you're growing up, and it kind of doesn't leave you perhaps in the way that it ought to. And that's what I was reminded of when you had that whole sequence of Richie confessing how obsessed he kind of still is with this one straight guy he knew from school. Like, it's fascinating, and it's this kind of not quite infantilization, but this idea of one's childhood being unlived and still floating around like a ghost. I don't know.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's really well observed, Gig. What you're saying there calls to mind something a friend of mine wrote about the episode recently, so I'm just going to read out verbatim what he said, which was that Richie, in voting for Thatcher and agreeing with Clause 28, is attempting to be something he isn't: straight. His being able to take out a mortgage on the palace, a Thatcher policy which would lead to future generations struggling with a housing crisis, works in his favour, after having lied about his sexuality and been subject to invasive questioning. Richie's playing out a fantasy where he's not only being an adult, voting Conservative and using his money to work on buying a house, he's fantasizing being a straight man moving in with a woman who benefits from his heterosexuality and right-wing views. All the while, Richie knows he can never be that man because he's gay and he's suffering of a virus that targets people like him more than any other demographic. And even when Richie gives it up to go home, go to the pub, be youthful and gay, he can't do it. In reality, is that even what he wants? What he wants is to be free from the curse of being gay in a society that doesn't want him, and the height of an epidemic that's killing men like him. So those aren't my words, but I think there's some interesting points about Richie there. What do you guys think?
The whole detail of Richie buying the Pink Palace with Jill and becoming sort of landlords of and having his own property, that's kind of an interesting detail. It doesn't have like a huge immediate impact on the plot of this episode, at least. I mean, I don't know if it's going to happen in episode 5, but it was interesting how he's definitely this idea. I think it maybe links in with the whole Thatcherism running political themes in this episode. This idea of becoming this self-made property owner, and just generally someone who has property and power rather than someone who's just slumming it and trying to scrape by. It was quite interesting. Also, like, RTD's last show had a Tory gay in it as well, so it's something he's been returning to a lot. So on the topic of Tory gays, Stephen Fry's character, the way in which he sort of disavows gayness completely in his last scene, that seems pertinent as well. This idea of
oh yeah,
because like Roscoe really thought that he was with like another gay man, at least that he was doing this stuff with, or being exploited for the sake of this, rich MP. But of course, he finds out that actually that Stephen Fry's character is actually more interested in, has this weird psychosexual thing with Margaret Thatcher. So I guess it's this tangle of sexuality which he gets tangled up in.
There's 2 points there: Thatcher and the strange psychology of the Stephen Fry character. I want to jump on the latter point first. So the line in question is when Roscoe brings up, "I thought you were gay," the Stephen Fry's character says, "Well, every so often one has to shove their faces in the shit so you can lift your head up and smell the roses afterwards." I had a reaction not unlike Roscoe. I just kind of gaped at that line out of shock. What do you think of specifically what he's saying here? Like, obviously it's evidence of a very weird mindset, but how did this line make you guys react?
Well, my immediate thoughts were like, when he says in the shit, like, I wonder, is there a double meaning there? Because I don't know, this might be weird, but I kind of almost got a bit of a racist subtext from it as well. I don't know. I think this idea of sort of black people being equated with shit, I think that's something that I think has some precedence. But then, of course, you have the literal aspect of maybe let's not get into the specifics of any particular sex acts here, but you know what I'm talking about.
Indeed.
Yeah. So no, it's interesting to see how Stephen Fry's character kind of treats these two sides of himself as sort of like heaven and hell, where heaven is Thatcher and the refined majesty of the Iron Lady, and the other half, like all these role plays he does with Roscoe, are like this sort of base, gross part that he nonetheless indulges in, but he sort of rationalises doing it by saying that it will make his appreciation of Thatcher all the sweeter or something.
It kind of reminded me of elsewhere in the episode. Ash talks about how historically, there are very famous men from ancient history who had what we might characterize as homosexual interactions now. These left out of state textbooks at the time, but it kind of reminds me of those societies where sex was often characterized more by the nature of the actual activity, receiving or giving, such as it were. I almost got that kind of vibe from Stephen Fry's character and his psychology, perhaps here, where it's perhaps homosexuality doesn't enter into it so much as the mechanics of the act itself. Who knows? It's like it calls to mind that in another life that character could have just been a very happy bisexual, but instead he's just said the most repugnant thing. To be honest, it felt like a very sort of cartoonishly evil line for a character to say, and I almost imagine RTD just challenging himself, just like, what's the most horrible, vicious thing I could make this character say right now? Actually, it reminded me of something you said, Neo, which is that like you have to watch bad TV to appreciate good TV. It's my ideology. Yeah, maybe, ethically less dubious than what Stephen Fry says.
Yeah, I think certainly, as you say, he could have been a happy bisexual in another life, but in this, I guess in this this situation that he's in, I think self-denial perhaps is something that's like big here. Like he has these desires and he's sort of pushing them down into the dirt and like not respecting the people he's like doing them with, I guess, like Roscoe.
His way of making it up to the corridors of power is that he to some extent has accepted the homosexuality that he is a homosexual, but he also characterizes himself as needing a sort of release valve, and then like once he's sort of had his fun, he can go back to ingratiating with Thatcher and sort of being the upright Tory. And before we psychosexually move on to Thatcher, there's just three little things about Stephen Fry that I just think merit mentioning. The first thing is that Stephen Fry has said that because of his DNA and upbringing, he knew if he ever got the call to be on an 80s show about HIV that he'd be playing a Tory minister. I found that kind of funny. The second thing is Stephen Fry misses the optimism of the 80s, but says he wasn't.
I was not a night animal. I genuinely wasn't. So I forced myself in a terribly pathetic 80s way that I started to take cocaine just so that I could go out. Because without it, I couldn't even think of going to. I'd be in bed by 9 o'clock.
And the third interesting thing about Fry, Tom, do you want to say this one, or do you want me to say it? It's the theft. You can say it. Stephen Fry, in the after show interview for this episode, he tries to take credit for a Russell T Davies Doctor Who line that David Tennant's 10th Doctor said.
You want weapons? We're in a library! Books! The best weapons in the world.
I do recognise that. I think that might be from my first novel, Liar, actually.
Well, I'm not calling you a liar, but you are definitely mistaken. This is Doctor Who! What? Yep. It's him trying to defend.
One Doctor Who writer stole it off me.
Yeah.
Oh my.
And he's like, yes, that sounds like the sort of thing I'm likely to say. It's like, what? How do you sit there with zero irony and say, yeah, I always come up with witty aphorisms, and it's probably something I said. It's probably one of the most Stephen Fry things to ever have happened. But anyway.
do we want to talk about how he was getting an erection? Or was he getting an erection? When we say he was getting erect over Margaret Thatcher, it's kind of a complicated topic, is it? Because it's not... My impression wasn't that he's getting sexually excited from the visage of Thatcher, which we don't see in the episode. My impression was it was kind of the stakes of the scenario, the prospect of rising up through the ranks, getting noticed by the lady herself. That was my impression. What do you guys think?
Or I guess it's kind of a sadomasochism thing. Like, Thatcher kind of represents repression, and from the conversation that Fry and Roscoe have in the back of the limo, where Fry is obviously into some very kinky sort of role-playing, it's possibly that angle. It's just that Thatcher represents, domination, and that ideal is something that excites the Stephen Fry character, maybe. I'm not sure.
Can our resident Brit speak to perceptions of Thatcher in this sense?
I mean, I think just in RTD linking getting a boner with Thatcher, I think he's going for the humorous angle here, which is this idea of this fetishism of Thatcher on the Tory side being a psychosexual thing. I think it probably is something to do with the idea of Thatcher herself. I think maybe rather than realism per se, I think RTD is going for the easy joke here, which is the idea of Tories having this sort of lust for this Iron Lady. So I think on one hand, yeah, I think it throws up those sexual complications that we were talking about earlier. I think I suspect it's probably something along those lines rather than something as innocent. But that's a good interpretation that you said earlier. The idea that the excitement of potentially being noticed by the Grand Thatcher has somewhat of a sexual thrill to it as well. Is interesting.
The whole sequence was a bit farcical, in the way it was set up in a literal corridor of power, and that little side hutch that they hide in. It was a little bit like Laurel and Hardy set piece or something. It was quite broad, I guess, comical, but I enjoyed it for what it was.
On the topic of Thatcher not appearing on screen, I find RTD's reasoning for this quite interesting. He says, "I think it would have been gimmicky. In the same way, I honestly wish we could have shown one of the critical moments in HIV history, which is Princess Diana holding the hand of a patient with HIV. We've talked about it so often that it's become a cliche, but it really was an immense thing that she did. Imagine all the advisors she had telling her not to do that, and the fear around the disease at the time, and yet she still did it. It was an amazing thing, so I'm sad that it isn't there. But if it was, all we'd be talking about now is the actress playing her." So what do you think of his reasoning for not including Thatcher's face, or including the Princess Diana moment?
I think it was a good call. I think, at the end of the day, we've talked about it before, but he's trying to make a show that focuses on these ordinary people. And I think maybe getting too wrapped up in these big historical celebrities and stuff, I think it maybe run the risk of detracting from that a little bit. I think it's funny seeing the back of Margaret Thatcher walking down a corridor, for example. But I've because that's kind of a humorous thing. But I think having something serious like Diana, or having the characters kind of being gushing over Diana and stuff, I think it would just be a lack of focus. Maybe if he'd done that 20 episode version of this show that was mooted, maybe it could have been in there.
I think one of the sort of, to my mind, underrated comedy moments in this show is Jill's dad giving the completely earnest suggestion that instead of doing a protest on the street, they just shake someone's hand like Princess Diana did, and he just says that completely straight without a hint of irony. It's very funny. I wonder if RTD wrote it as a sarcastic quip, but the actor who plays Jill's dad is just why don't you just shake someone's hand? I thought that was very funny.
Princess Di gave a handshake. Can you just do something like that?
Off the back of Thatcher, I feel like there are two pathways in front of us. First, do we want to go down the Section 28 route, or do we want to discuss Norman Fowler and the PSA that opened the episode with John Hurt's voice?
Well, I feel like we could go from the latter and then back to the former.
Okay, so Norman Fowler, well, the PSA itself, very famous. The episode opens with it. It's got John Hurt's lovely, gravelly Doctor Who voice talking about HIV in a very terrifying way. It's a very terrifying PSA, and it was part of a huge campaign that Norman Fowler, Secretary in charge of health under Thatcher, was a huge part of. And he clashed a little bit with Thatcher because he wanted it to be even more intense and even more creating fear among people. Like, he wanted civil defense sirens blaring in the PSA, and Thatcher thought that was too much, and she struck that down.
And he wanted Thatcher to speak on television about it, but she pulled out at the last second, just out of fear, I suppose.
A very recent, a 2016 BBC show called The 80s with Dominic Sambrook characterised Fowler's role with the HIV crisis as a hero, and said an interview of him talking about the need for education about HIV to the song Holding Out for a Hero.
Over the next few years, the priority must be public education. It must be getting the message through to the general public and, but perhaps most of all, to those groups most at risk about the dangers of AIDS itself.
Fowler designed a public relations strategy on a genuinely national scale.
There is now a danger that has become a threat to us all.
So there's this interesting kind of tension in what we've been talking about, the conservative leadership at the time of the HIV epidemic, and with this man who some may call a hero for pioneering this PSA campaign, among other things. What do we think of the campaign itself?
I guess, first of all, I think like the actual ad with the monolith is a really great piece of filmmaking. I mean, it was done by Nicholas Roeg, who's a director I really like. And later on in this episode, you can see a poster for Nick Roeg's The Man Who Fell to Earth. So I wonder if that was sort of a deliberate nod, maybe by Peter Hoare or something, as from one filmmaker to another. I think like the public health campaign was obviously a good thing. I mean, it's better to have a public health campaign than to not. But I guess it's also important to note that the UK wasn't the only country to have a really good public health campaign. India had a really good one. New South Wales had one. Berlin and Amsterdam both pushed really hard to push like the clean needles thing for drug users. So they didn't shy away from sort of talking to drug users directly. They really campaigned for that. So the UK wasn't the only place to do it. But the key flaw in the campaign is that like all the literature, all the TV broadcast, because there was a whole week of AIDS related broadcasting in 1987. I wasn't alive during this time. I was just reading about this, but there was a whole week, and all of the programming is aimed at an implied straight audience. So they did mention homosexuality, but it's always in the context of like, this disease was only confined to the gay community. Now you should be worried because it's to everyone. And so like on that pamphlet that went from every household, there's a big box that says, why should you care about AIDS? And then right next to that it says, it's not just a gay disease. And it's like, oh, is that why I should care about AIDS? Not the fact that it's like a horribly murderous virus that's killing people by the thousands. So it has that whole problem of ignoring the gay community. And also the fact that, you know, ordinary people like the bloody typical suburban household, Clive and Valerie, nothing's stopping them from actually sort of getting worried about it, because they're just utterly complacent, you know, assuming that Richie is immune from that because he's a good boy. So yeah, it's not, I don't see it as some like holy angelic life-saving event in history, but you know, it did probably have a positive impact at the end of the day.
The perspective you've outlined there, this is probably a tangent, but it's just the way you described it, how it's so targeting heterosexual people, how the focus, it's like we were talking earlier about those tweets that are like, the worst thing about it is the hypocrisy. You know, how it's entirely focused on the straight experience, or how the straight people would think about that. It kind of reminds me of, I've always had some sort of reservations around a lot of the messaging that was used when, in my lifetime, I certainly remember it used a lot to promote legalization of gay marriage and popularization of gay rights in general. And the messaging I'm talking about is the born this way messaging. Gay people were born this way. Bisexual people were born this way. So we must support it. Of course, I'm happy for what I presume is success that kind of messaging has had in helping to further LGBT rights, but I've always felt a little bit uncomfortable with what feels to me like it's inherently apologetic phrasing. If you don't have any moral problem with homosexuality or bisexuality, then why is it being something impermeable from birth? Why is that more of a convincing argument than someone theoretically choosing to be gay? If being gay isn't wrong, then why is the better argument that they were born that way rather than they chose to be? If it's not a bad thing, why is this messaging where, to my ears, it's almost phrased like a kind of curse? We can't help it, we were just born gay. Why does that messaging seem to work? I think it's proved an effective argument to heterosexual audiences, and so I applaud any material benefits that it's wrought, but the framing of it has always quietly bothered me a bit. And what you, Tom, identified in the complete framing to straight audience aspect of the PSA campaign, that sort of reminds me of it. I kind of feel like it's built around appeasing homophobic people almost. And while any material benefits that brings about are of course a good thing, the nature of that messaging is just, to me, kind of an unpleasant reminder of that inherent homophobia at play here. Just that pretext of immorality conflated with homosexuality. Yeah. Any thoughts on what I'm throwing around here?
I guess it's maybe something that's the idea of it being like a negative thing is maybe something. Obviously, it's more obvious in the HIV context. When it comes to just being gay, I think maybe it's something that's maybe subtext depending on who is interpreting it and who's maybe adding that in, I guess. But yeah, I see what you mean.
I guess, like, completely denying the categories of, like, gay, straight, to imply that they're totally non-permeable, I guess that strikes me as a bit throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But yeah, I guess, I don't know.
Yes, absolutely. I'm definitely not alone in wishing I'd grown up without the supposed non-permeable nature of such things so emphasized in culture.
But just back to the public health campaign, this is my last point, but I think it's sort of illustrative to note that they had special programs, special documentaries, special ads for tattoo artists because they were particularly at risk. So they had special programming for tattoo artists, I think hairdressers or maybe dentists. I can't remember, but the point is they had ads for these groups and there were no ads sort of about the gay experience or gay lifestyles, or there was nothing. So I guess that's the main failing of that campaign.
Yeah, I think that hero fetishizing that you kind of mentioned, Neo, with this whole holding out for a hero thing, I think there's maybe a degree to which it's not acknowledging that even with them doing all that stuff, it's still kind of, to an extent, I think it's still kind of too little too late, because there's already loads of people who had died, and it's just, they'd spent long enough ignoring this thing. So, like, the one time one person does something, even a little thing to address the crisis, suddenly they're the hero of the day. It's like, well, no. You know?
I think it's important to characterize that as no one's like saying, damn you, Norman Fowler, for raising awareness. There's none of that. It's just, you pull these things out to a broader perspective over time, and you like see how long it took to kickstart these kind of campaigns. And it's like when we talked in our last discussion about Russell T Davies and the writing of experiences that aren't your own. It's not blaming the people that are spearheading the good thing. It's not blaming Norman Fowler for doing this campaign, and it's not blaming Russell T Davies for writing such and such. It's lamenting the institutional issues that focus it down to these tinier examples. So on that topic of Tom talking about how the campaigns weren't targeted to gay people and things like that, and on that topic of how long it took this Norman Fowler campaign to rise up, I think there's an interesting thing Russell T Davies talks about a lot, about how a big issue with HIV was the suffering in silence. How, in this episode we get how the real Jill's character mother talks about if straight boys were dying in these numbers, there'd be riots, the world would have stopped. And Richie is so in his silence, he's not talking to his friends about his possible HIV diagnosis, he's going around to sketchy houses to try battery acid and things like that. It's this enclosed silence, presumably brought about a lot by shame.
It was considered to be shameful, but it was seen to be a gay disease. So the silence creates the fear, creates the problem. It's self-perpetuating. The disease got worse because of silence.
It's tough. It's a tough disease, and there were cruel times. Not just the disease is cruel, but the world in which the disease existed, where these things were kept secret. The research wasn't funded. With the secrecy came shame, because it was seen to be, obviously we know it's far more than a gay male disease. It can affect anyone, but it was seen, and this drama largely looks at the gay male population. With that in the 80s came fear and shame, and with that comes ignorance, and with that comes death. That makes the death toll rise because it's secret. And it is so strange in this day of the coronavirus to see the virus being talked about every night on the news. If only we'd had that in 1985, if only discussions had been open, because it all becomes a little bit shameful. But we're not ashamed, but the whole situation is so shameful and sad and dark, and the illness is so horrible that I think maybe we didn't forget those people. We never forget those people.
Yeah.
And possibly we talk about them more than most as well.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, those memories got kind of boxed up in a dark corner. Part of the problem with the HIV virus is that it wasn't on the news. It happened in silence, and it happened in fear, and that then makes people lie, and that then makes people ashamed, and the closet door just tightens, and the situation gets worse and worse. That silence literally led to more deaths.
Yeah, when she said that line that if straight boys were dying in those numbers, the world would have stopped, it put me in mind of how these days, so many... it's kind of maybe slightly ironic because so many men, even now, are victims of... Well, they kill themselves, right? There's tons of... Male suicide is a huge thing among men, for example. But, for example, the world doesn't stop for that, for example, because I think there's something, different about it. I think what I'm trying to get here is that, men sort of do die, including straight ones, but because there isn't that sort of this idea of that outside virus, for example, doing it, then it still doesn't make a wave, I guess. I guess it's this idea of different things can be completely overlooked or sublimated within society for different reasons. I think masculinity is probably sort of a part of it in each case. It's interesting. I don't know. I say that a lot, but yeah. See, silence. You mentioned silence as well, and one thing in this episode that was really, really sad was when Ash was lying in bed with Richie, and we got kind of that abstract sort of almost perhaps even a love confession from Ash when he says he might be waiting for Richie. So in other words, he's not having sex with other people. He might be saving himself for Richie, which is, I guess, the closest to a love confession that you get with these sort of characters. And but of course, Richie's just sort of lying there, not admitting anything. It's so depressing. I guess it really comes down to how the inability to tell the truth, I guess, and to open up is just so utterly destructive. I guess that's at the heart of a lot of the show.
Unless Tom has anything to say on that, I'm happy to go 27 sections forward.
Oh no, that's fine. You can push on.
So section 28, the prohibition on promoting homosexuality by teaching or publishing material. So we have in this episode this this very... is didactic the wrong word?
I think you could call it didactic in some ways. It's sort of explaining.
Polemical, maybe.
Yeah, polemical.
Yeah, polemic, that's a good word.
This polemic about how, for all this talk of having to remove the gay material, corrupting the youths in the libraries, what gay material? What RTD has said about this is, I think it would have been odd to have written a gay drama set in the 80s with no mention of sex. Well, indeed, with no mention of Section 28. But what Ash says in that scene, I've been dying to say for years. It's why I'm a writer, because I'm arrogant enough to think that I have things to say. I think it's a very good speech because it's very true and single-handedly undermines the whole nonsense of that regulation. But it is a freestanding speech that's outside the entire narrative of It's a Sin. I remember thinking, I hope this episode is short enough to include this, because if we're running over length, it will be cut. And then he also says, what a monstrous thing the government did with Section 28. It was genuinely wrong. If you were a teacher and a child was being bullied for being gay in front of you, there was nothing you could say. It was immoral on every level and took decades to be undone from the legislation. And then he goes a bit into, we've discussed this before, but why it's part of why he's so vigilant about gay rights and in particular the laws that pertain to him, because he thinks with every gay drama, I sit here absolutely convinced that the rights we have are paper thin and could be lost at any moment. Don't tell me to relax on any laws, any freedoms we have, any liberty. We have to be absolutely vigilant all the time. So what did you guys think of that scene?
I felt as a freestanding speech, I could clearly see why it was worth including in the show. Interesting. I think it annoyed me slightly how, poor Ash's character. I mean, Ash doesn't really have a great deal to do in the show in general, and his one big moment sort of gets stolen from him, which just turns into a gag about how he couldn't actually say anything at all. And it was this whole thing about I felt like the two things, like the Section 28 sort of trying to purge every last mention of gayness from the libraries and the curriculum and stuff, and this issue of there being so little like gayness in the historical record, like in the sort of in the literature world to begin with, they kind of feel like perhaps, I feel like that because Section 28 is trying to get rid of even those last little dregs that are there, I think like the real response to that is like, I guess maybe it didn't quite feel like the response that really cut to the core of Section 28, I guess, is what I felt. Because like, I think, I'm not quite sure how to put this, but like, while it's obviously true that there's obviously this complete, like lack or kind of like deficiency of any sort of representation of gay people in terms of stuff that kids would be reading, I think the essence of Section 28 is that even if there was a tiny little like one germ of it anywhere in that library, they wanted to purge that as well. So it's kind of the horror of it is not that they somehow like fail to notice that there's very relatively little gay stuff, but that they were so obsessed with getting rid of it that they wanted to get rid of even the smallest like speck. So I guess I just felt that while obviously the speech itself was like interesting and cool and fine, it was kind of like I didn't quite feel it had the cutting impact, like the cutting sort of swipe at the policy that maybe I was kind of wanting or like thirsting for, I guess. There you go, I've rabbited on enough about that.
I guess the kind of weird thing is that it's sort of, while Section 28 was a really recent thing at the time that Ash is saying that, what he's really criticizing is sort of the vast swathes of like the past, you know, our entire modern history. So in a weird way, he's not criticizing the new legislation. He's criticizing our entire culture, which in that way, it maybe doesn't strike at the heart of the new legislation. So I don't know, it's sort of an eccentric speech in that way.
Well, yeah, even with what complaints I might have, like, it's nice that RTD has a platform to say things that he would like to say himself, but put them on the screen. You know, it's fundamentally, like, on a basic level, it's worth doing.
Yeah, and I like when you hear a piece of writing and you can sort of feel that it's something the writer has been wanting to say for years, which I guess is kind of the whole show, but especially that speech.
I'm from a family full of teachers, and it's like Clause 28, Section 28 was like the most ridiculous thing in the world, because they were, but apart from anything else, they were protecting us from nothing. It's not like the school libraries were full of homosexuals and lesbians. It's like, you know, believe me, I just wrote a speech about this in the new script, but it's like, I just written a speech in which a teacher in 1988 is sent to go and empty the library of all the gay material, and they come back to him, he goes, there's nothing. He says, I looked in Shakespeare, and there's nothing. He said, you might get a bit of fruity stuff on stage with a man in a toga, but that's the director, not the books. Because in the whole of Shakespeare, there's not one man with a man, and there's not one woman with a woman. Jane Austen did not write any lesbians. There is nothing in history, there was nothing in the history books. You might have had Julius Caesar, and you might have Aristotle, and you might have had them having a little fling with the cat and mouse, but not in school history books. You look in Sport, you look in Asterix, you look in Tintin, you look in Peanuts, you think Marcy would be gay, but no, she has a cross on Charlie Brown. It's like there is nothing there. They built a law in Section 28 against nothing, because there's nothing in the library, there's nothing to influence any gay child anywhere.
On the Ash speech, I just wanted to say I appreciated the brief allowance allowed that, like, you could go too far and almost actually erase some non-heterosexuality in trying to say all the great men of history were straight or whatever. So I appreciated that Ash, you know, talked about flings with catamites, and he allowed for, because of course there's a lot to talk about with the sexuality of past figures and how we even apply modern notions of sexuality onto past figures, past periods. So I appreciated that. Oh, something else interesting historically. Russell T Davies has said he doesn't believe in making a pink section of history.
In Wales at the moment, we're having the discussion about how we teach our kids in schools. There's talk about changing the curriculum. Are you one of those people who thinks it's right that perhaps we do LGBT plus history, so we know about the people who came before and how they changed things and their contribution to life?
I do, absolutely, as part of history. I don't believe in a separate section hiving us off into a pink corner. But you could talk about Julius Caesar having male lovers. I think it's just part of history. The constant questions about William Shakespeare to this day, I just think that those those are interesting and fun things to discuss and debate. It's just ease it into the curriculum with every other fact. And people will complain and say there's no need for it. But what straight people never realize or don't care about is that unless you do that, everyone is considered automatically to be straight. And straight people never see that, never understand it, and so sit there, probably staring at their televisions now, blithering in ignorance. It needs doing, and it will be done with people like us making it happen.
You know, he seems to think some people have this idea of setting aside to talk about gay history, where his view is more, well, they've always been part of history, so they are history, period. They are, you know, history is history. And the issue there is just straight people who automatically assume everyone ever to have been straight. Well, I guess with Section 28 and the idea of erasing gay characters or gay experience in literature, in texts, it's interesting that even today, Russell T Davies, you know, while that legislation was of course undone, he doesn't think that gay characters or gay representation is that prevalent in media. As, you know, some seem to think it's extraordinarily prevalent. He doesn't think so. He says, "It's good. It's so much better than it was 20 years ago when we were like a magnesium flare in the darkness. Nonetheless, I do maintain that if you take soaps and LGBTQ writers out of the equation, you can watch an awful lot of 9 o'clock drama and streaming drama without gay characters in it. I loved Bridgerton, but I was astonished that it had about 10 seconds of gayness in it. It's a show that's so lavish, gorgeous, and wonderful. It's a great show. But can you gay that up, please?"
I mean, he's right. Like, yeah.
So while the situation is definitely improved, it's another thing that we can't relax on. He's right, did you say?
Yeah, he's right. He's absolutely right. You know, it's yeah. There's nothing to even really debate there. Because we're on this idea of like governmental repression, should we talk about the whole protest bit that forms the ending of this episode now? Because it's kind of the climax of the episode, and it all sort of leads to that bit.
It was no revolution of the Daleks.
I mean, it's possibly more dramatic than the revolution of the Daleks, but it was, I guess, it was, I think, you know, my favourite bit, actually, of that whole sequence was when Roscoe and the bar owner are kind of reconciling with each other on the floor. I guess, because obviously, you know, the bar owner's really mad at Roscoe for ditching, but I think just in the terror of being about to get sort of attacked by the police, they kind of have that reconciliation. It's really sweet.
I agree. Amari Douglas is so good. And also, I think, like, when Jill is being restrained by the police and her parents are, like, lamenting on the side of the road, it's probably one of the saddest moments of the whole show for me. I mean, that was, like, really difficult to watch. And the big hero entrance of, like, Richie tackling the police officer, I thought that was really, really good. I thought it was a shame that, like, that was the very first image of the show that was released in marketing, because I think it's a pretty major beat to spoil. But yeah, I just love that, and I love the music. That motif, which I think is Richie's theme.
Oh my god, what did they do to you?
Possibly. It plays in episode 1 in the Pink Palace, but yeah, that twinkly synthy theme, just really good all around.
Yeah, it's full of great little moments. The negative onlookers being like, "Oh, you gotta not touch him, be careful touching him," to the cops. But you know, some onlookers were positive. There were those 2 girls that were cheering for Richie attacking the police and everything. So it was a real public display of all these sentiments. Something I found disturbing, apart from the protest itself, was just how much they struggled to get people showing up. I think one of the protesters talks about how many gay people there are in London or whatever, and that they get such a small amount to come out. I mean, you understand the protest, but even, I guess there weren't straight allies in the volume you may have now than there were then. Just to see so little show of support there was really saddening for me, just to see the actual number turn out. I understand why gay men might be leery of showing up to something like that. I completely understand that, but I'd hope for more people like Jill's parents to show up in support.
I think regarding the whole sequence, like, you could, if you wanted to be sort of, I don't know, if you want to be sued, I guess, you could argue that, for example, the shot of the police putting on the gloves in unison as they arrive, that's absolutely chilling. And you could argue that something like that conveys more horror than that conveys enough horror that you don't immediately need to cut in like an ADR of a guy saying, "Oh, make sure you don't touch them." Like I guess like it's like, but at the same time, I guess it would be absurd to sort of criticize the scene for portraying homophobes as too, I don't know, loud or obnoxious or whatever, but because it's like
they are the stereotype that they are.
Yeah, I guess you could describe the sequences when it comes to the onlookers. You could describe them as maybe a bit like cartoonified. Like you have the baddies and the goodies, and they're clearly bifurcated and stuff. And there's like 6 of them, and we cut back and forth between them. They're all shouting stuff like generic stuff. But no, I guess maybe I guess perhaps. Obviously, it's not like some huge budget thing. It's a TV production, so it's not going to have like some like white knuckle thrills or whatever. But I guess it's just. I guess the story is what's important rather than sort of the being like an action-packed thingy.
You're upset there were no Daleks laser beams.
Yeah. Get some Dalek drones in to enforce the thing. Yeah.
I get what you mean about the onlookers, because they kind of remind me of like the extras in the Raimi Spider-Man movies, like the New Yorkers throwing their cans at the Green Goblin, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Also, really weird note, but I swear there's one line from the onlookers that's like repeated. Like you hear at one point you say, "Don't beef with me, mate. I'll come in there and give you a slap." And then like 30 seconds later, you hear it again. It's
you
so
violated the law.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I loved seeing Colin's mum come back for the protest. That was so great.
Yeah, well, we've brought up Daleks. Should we move to the actual Daleks in the episode?
I have just one thing about the classic Who sequence. I swear to God, the corridor must be from New Who. I swear I've seen that exact corridor in New Who multiple times. It's just a random Doctor Who lizard brain thing. Yes.
So the Doctor Who sequence in the episode, there's a few things to talk about with it here, despite what you may believe. For me, the first thing that strikes me about it, this is just from my PR perspective that I think is wonderful, but it offered such a great way to market the show, in that before the show came out, you could get this show about HIV in the 80s on the cover of Doctor Who magazine. You could get it on the cover of SFX, a variant cover, but still, because it's Russell T Davies doing a new Doctor Who episode. It's set in the 80s. It's got Daleks in it. What is this madness? It's such a thing that it's so conductive to marketing in the geek realm, which has so many consumers. So I was admiring that kind of typical Davies mastery of public relations. What a great way to do it. What a great way to sneak in something into your show to get it advertised so well. And then I had egg on my face when I read the actual impetus of the sequence, where it was actually born from. And it was not, as I assumed, from canny public relations. What it actually was, Russell T Davies watched Doctor Who throughout the 1980s, and I'm quoting from said Doctor Who magazine. Russell says, "But it was no way cool to be a Doctor Who fan. Not that I'm interested in being cool, but it was a slightly shameful thing. I remember having a one-night stand once with a man who spotted a Doctor Who book on my shelf and went, 'Hey, I was a soldier in the caves of Androzani.' I went, 'Oh, what's that?' I literally shrugged it off. How ridiculous. I was too embarrassed to say, 'What was it like being in the caves of Androzani? Did you meet John Nathan Turner?'"
That's a bit in Queer as Folk.
Really? Fascinating.
He used that in Queer as Folk. It was very funny.
Drawn from real life experience, much like It's a Sin.
Yeah.
So in later years, Russell's Doctor Who shame faded. "I just got over myself," he said. "Remembrance of the Daleks in particular gave him hope. I did love those Sylvester McCoy years. The show felt much more open." Then one night at the Pink Palace, the real one, Russell met Dursley McLinden, who played RAF surgeon and Ace's love interest, Mike Smith, in Remembrance of the Daleks. Davies says, "What a beautiful boy. He was one of Jill's friends and one of the first people I ever met who'd been in Doctor Who. I went to Jill's 30th and there he was. He was already very ill, but he was so hilarious and lovely, I was thrilled to meet him." And this actor that Russell was enamoured with, he died in 1995 at 30 years old. Sophie Aldred, who played Ace in Remembrance of the Daleks in Doctor Who in the 1980s, said, "Dursley McLinden had one of the best smiles I'd ever seen. I last saw him at Joe Allen's restaurant in London. Even though he was walking with the aid of crutches and looking peaky, his smile was as dazzling as ever. we chatted about old times. He was always tickled by having appeared with the Daleks. Although Sophie and McLinden never actually spoke about his illness, she knew then that she wouldn't get many more chances to see him. Russell says he became very wonderful in his AIDS activism when he was ill, but to me, he was that boy from Remembrance of the Daleks. That's why I knew I had to write a Dalek scene in It's a Sin. I didn't do it as a joke. It's not me going, hooray, let's get a few pages in Doctor Who magazine. It literally felt natural. I was really desperate to do it. It's a little smile towards Dursley, who I loved. I did it for Dursley.
That is a brilliant story. I had no idea about any of that. The fact that I didn't know that about the actor from that episode, and I didn't know that Jesus, like, that's completely new appreciation for what RTD was doing with the show here. That's such a brilliant connection.
That's why I read Doctor Who magazine.
Yeah. Wow. That's really fascinating. So I guess it's like, so Richie is kind of in that role, that one guy who maybe someone might see on Doctor Who, and maybe, years later they might find out that he had HIV. That's so fascinating.
Yeah, Davies also said, Richie isn't an actor with a middling normal career just because it's fun, although I do have enormous fun with it, let's be honest, but because there's always a danger with people with HIV that someone's remembering all those boys and they'll say, who knows what great doctors we lost, who knows what cures for cancer we lost. He brings Richie's boyfriend into it and talks about how you can be a daft actor appearing in 2 episodes of a soap, but your life is just as valid and just as important and just as beautiful as any great star. I love showing Richie's life as an actor who gets these small roles. He doesn't have this huge part, to play. He's not like a superstar in this episode, but just to see like the life. What was it like for those actors that just pop up in classic Doctor Who for a few episodes? What was their experience like? I'm really fascinated in that perspective because it's kind of alien to me, at least, more as a Doctor Who fan. So I read more about the actors who are really invested in the roles, playing the Doctor or the companions. So it's interesting to see what it's like for the regular people just popping up and playing a soldier fighting the Daleks.
It's really intriguing that one Dalek moment, it's like, it's only when a staffer on that show actually points something out to Richie, like something wrong with your skin, that Richie suddenly, it becomes real for Richie at that point because someone else has actually noticed it and it's suddenly come up in his job, in his work. Like his acting is, the place where he can be, I guess, someone else or just like step out of his life a little bit, but suddenly the reality is sort of crushing in. It was a really savvy choice.
It's kind of a creepy scene as well, where that guy's leaning down and he keeps looking at him and comparing to his hand. And for me, it's not the guy himself who's putting his face close to Richie that's creeping me out. It's just this looming sense of something is really wrong. If he's having to keep checking the light and keep checking the skin, it's just this mounting sense of dread. And in Richie, you can just kind of feel that crushing, inevitable sense of, yeah, it's real. Also, with this scene, it's got to be said, it's such a joy to see the recreation of how old television looked. Not just with this Doctor Who scene, but also that show that Richie's boyfriend appeared in the last episode. I'm really loving the recreation of this old television. I think it looks really authentic. Do you guys get that? Or does it look simulated to you?
It's certainly putting a certain other currently ongoing show to shame in that respect.
Oh, WandaVision. Is that what you're alluding to?
Yes,
Right.
explain the joke.
I haven't seen it. I haven't seen WandaVision.
Fair enough.
No, I think the recreations look really good. Recently I watched the Normal Heart film and they have 80s television in that, and you can very clearly see that it's just like a video filter overlaid over crisp HD footage. And this didn't feel like that to me. I also loved the recreation of how Classic Who sounded because we have Murray Gold doing a outright attempt to mimic Classic Who music.
Remember, if they get through, we lose the crystal. And if we lose that, it's the end of the world.
Obviously, Murray Gold's a virtuoso. He does a very good job. Although I think it sounded maybe aired a little more towards like a John Carpenter type synth sound than Classic Who, but it's sort of splitting hairs. It sounded very cool. I guess my only other thoughts on the scene is that Richie's delivery of the line, although not to undermine the like extremely sweet reason for putting the scene in, but Richie's delivery of the line was quite funny. I mean, that just like, it's the end of the world. Like, I get the sense that Richie's character would have been one of those people that Doctor Who fans meme about for years and years, like Soldeed or something, or Professor Zaroff, or the no, not the Mind Probe guy from Five Doctors. What else? I also, while this technically wasn't in the episode, I think the fact that it's called Regression of the Daleks is really keyed into what happens in the rest of this episode, which is Richie sort of regressing back into his comfortable childhood life, going back to the Isle of Wight, regressing psychologically to a certain extent. So I like that on a dramatic wavelength.
Another thing with Regression of the Daleks I found really interesting, this will be on the screen now if you're watching the YouTube video, it's that Russell T Davies didn't just write this scene of it. He said, as I alluded to earlier, he created this kind of imaginary plot line that we've never seen. Because this isn't a recreation of an actual episode. It might look like Resurrection of the Daleks, and it might situate around the time of Remembrance of the Daleks, but it's neither. Russell T Davies has created an original story so Richie's taking part in this alternate history Doctor Who episode that was never actually created. And he describes it as the Doctor meets an old friend, Drax, aboard a spaceship, but the Daleks invade and they steal the Crystal of Ore, and the crystal's strange radiation affects everyone strangely. So the Doctor at the time, Sylvester McCoy, de-regenerates back into Colin Baker and then Peter Davison. So as the Time Lords regenerate backwards and the Daleks revert into Khaleds, can the Doctor convince Ace that her new boyfriend is a young Davros? I want to see this so much.
That's beautiful. I think you can tell that like the Ace Davros plot is... RTD is a real stickler, because that is a plot that would not appear in the Colin Baker era, that would not appear in the Peter Davison era. That is a Sylvester McCoy era plot. Like, it feels very similar to The Curse of Fenric and like Ace meeting her grandmother type deal. RTD is a real attention to detail kind of guy. But yeah, I find that all very amusing.
Yes, I love the alternate history stuff. We even have that with the French Revolution play Jill is in, which of course isn't Les Miserables, but it feels adjacent to it. I love all those little alternate history things in the show. It's just a great little sense of fun. Speaking of fun, what did we think when Richie compels his school friend Martin to just lie back and not think about it and just have an orgasm? Everyone wants to have an orgasm. Don't mind your sexuality. Thoughts on the whole frenzied exchange there?
It was one of the more difficult scenes to watch without cringing and pausing for like an hour. That was.
Yeah, and I think, again, RTD made a very canny choice that the friend doesn't just immediately, like, he's not, like, homophobic outwardly. No. He doesn't recoil, and that complicates the scene because, like, it means that he continues to sit there rather than just, like, running away or like, hitting him or something really bad like that. It protracts the awkward cringiness of it, and Ollie Alexander is so good at portraying that sort of manic desperation. It reminded me a little bit of, like, Time Lord Victorious. Like, he just wants to command all this power around him. But, yeah, really great sequence. It reminded me, like, a little bit of Moonlight, just that whole vibe of, like, going back to childhood, and it felt very cinematic. Peter Horde really does an amazing job with those sequences, and the spotlight, the car headlight ballet scene. I think we'll talk about another inspiration for that soon, but that was pretty much directly lifted from this film Columbus from 2017, where it's pretty much the exact same setup. It's like a character dancing in front of car headlights while someone who they have really strong feelings towards sits in the car uncomfortable. It's like, I'm not accusing RTD of plagiarism. In fact, I think it's like he's unwittingly struck on some very primal emotions in that scene, which maybe the director of Columbus also did. But maybe you want to introduce the other plagiarism that RTD admitted to.
First of all, I really love Columbus.
Yes.
I'd recommend this movie very highly. It's really good. Secondly, something else I really love and really recommend because it's really good is this show by Damon Lindelof. We covered his most recent show, Watchmen, on this channel, on this podcast, but his biggest critical success, I'd say, is The Leftovers, which is just this marvelous show about grief and life and death and having to deal with the perpetually unknown. But Russell T Davies, and this surprised me, one of his inspirations for that ballet scene, Richie dancing by the streetlights in front of the headlights of the car to his friend Martin, was The Leftovers.
People always say, where'd you get ideas from? And strangely, I got that idea. I can trace the origin of that idea to a series called The Leftovers. I love The Leftovers, and it's a brilliant show. And I literally sat watching and thinking, God, I wish I could write like this. I think it's ineffable and beautiful, and it rises above like the domestic and the everyday and becomes big. And it has a lot of scenes in cars at night lit by headlights. And it was watching that, some scenes of cars and headlights at night, that this went click. That lead character, if he turns these moments, which in The Leftovers are usually very dark and manic, if he turns that into something beautiful, that's a really interesting scene.
And sort of a dreamlike atmosphere as well, I suppose. Something that's kind of hard to express.
Yeah.
With the whole sequence with that guy, I guess, you know, you mentioned earlier that he doesn't have some homophobic reaction. He doesn't turn into the villain of the scene. He doesn't start being cruel to Richie or anything. And I think that's so important. I think having him be surprisingly compassionate towards Richie, even as Richie, I think it's crucial that Richie is kind of the one whose flaws are on display, because Richie's the one who's going on the journey of this episode. He has to be, I think, the one with the problem in this scene, because he's having this breakdown. And the fact that while Martin, I don't know if his name is Martin. That
it is.
While this straight guy is obviously made deeply uncomfortable by Richie babbling about, you know, sexual fantasies and cum and wanting to suck him off and stuff, the fact that the fact that Martin is able to ask, like, is something wrong? Like, what's wrong? Like, why aren't you telling me what's wrong? You know, what's happened? He's able to sense that something's clearly not right with Richie, and it's that disarming compassion and honesty that kind of puts the focus back on Richie and Richie's inability to talk about his feelings. And instead, of course, he gets this ballet dance, because earlier on they're talking about it and like ballet, like it's kind of something silly, but you know, it ultimately, even though Richie has confessed that he's gay earlier on, it's this ballet scene that's only like the real confession of his vulnerability, I suppose.
Yeah. I've two thoughts on this straight friend, Martin. The first is that the scene where Richie is confessing to him, and at first it's kind of sweet saying he had a crush on him in school, because everyone gets wistful about school. We talked about people's memories with school earlier. I think that's kind of sweet, and Martin was kind of fine with that. But then he does what I think Colin did when he was suffering from HIV in the third episode, and he takes this moment of sweet vulnerability and he gets a little too vulnerable, and he starts revealing sexual data that the other person doesn't really want to hear. So it's kind of interesting Richie has that kind of parallel. He's been both the perpetrator and the subject of that kind of exchange. The other thing is that for all the actor of Martin's attractiveness, his name is Johnny Green, for what it's worth, for all Johnny Green's attractiveness, so much so that Richie goes on about how frequently he would masturbate over him, the character at any rate. Well, I know where this actor Johnny Green is from, and it's somewhere his looks are much less a factor, because it's audio drama. And here's an interesting little connection. Well, Torchwood is a Doctor Who spin-off that aired on TV between 2006 and 2011, an ostensibly more adult-themed sci-fi series about a group of adults dealing with supernatural and alien threats, mostly in Cardiff. It got revived as a series of audio dramas eventually, and Johnny Green, the actor for Richie's straight friend Martin here, he plays one of the lead characters in what are billed as Series 5 and Series 6 of Torchwood, which are like audio seasons, 2 sets of a dozen hour-long episodes, like TV episodes without the visuals, if you can imagine that. While Russell T Davies didn't write those 2 audio seasons, as he did much of the Torchwood TV seasons, he did create the character that this actor Johnny Green plays on them. So just an odd little connection there. Gig and I may have recognised that character's voice tending the bar on the Isle of Wight, since we've heard so many hours of it. And we in fact covered those 2 audio seasons. We have podcast discussions of those here as well. It's a funny thing, there's that old saying about a face for radio, but here we have a character who, on It's a Sin, his attractiveness is such a key part of his scenes, yet he's got that big accomplished role on audio for all that.
I thought that actor's performance really, really stood out. Because I mean, it's a difficult role to play. Like, it's you don't want him to be too sort of like a wise old sage or anything, but you also don't want him to be like completely uncomfortable. But I just feel like that type of guy is very believable. Like, I feel like I know people like that who are just super easygoing and yeah.
Well, that reminds me. In Torchwood, his character is very gay, so it's interesting here that he's the first episode of season 5 opens with him. No, I shouldn't reveal. Well,
okay.
Yeah, I won't reveal that actually. He plays a very gay character in Torchwood, so it's funny that he plays this kind of nonplussed straight character here.
I guess just one last thing that occurs to me regarding the whole Campbell-esque story arc that Richie has is that, like, I guess it's just an amusing detail, but when Richie comes back at the end and reveals to everyone that he sort of implicitly reveals to everyone that he has AIDS and stuff, it reminded me of what his sister said earlier about how now Richie's here, it's all going to be about him again. And the way in which Richie showing up as the hero of the day, nonetheless, as great as that is, it's kind of the oxygen is sort of sucked towards Richie rather than all the other people in the protest. Yeah. It's kind of amusing. I guess maybe it feeds into that critique of the show that's been floating around, which maybe might come up again when we talk about next episode, but yes. The idea that it's maybe there's a degree of privilegedness to it in kind of focusing so much on this, like, you know what I'm talking about, right? Like, yeah.
Yes, I'm eager to engage with that, but I think it'll make most sense engaging when we've seen all 5 episodes.
Should we start to transition to the Sin spoiler zone and I'll drop out then?
Sure, yes. So for the last time, Gig will depart us as we enter our final Sin spoiler zone, given that there's only 1 episode left. So thanks, Gig.
Yep, farewell, good chat, guys.
Godspeed.
Yes, and so now we enter our final Sin spoiler zone on account of this being the penultimate episode. So if this is the last time we'll get a chance to discuss an episode in context of and with the spoilers for the entire series. Did anything strike out to you in terms of spoilers for the finale with this episode 4, Tom?
No. And I'm sorry to say that,
no?
But I guess like this episode is it feels very standalone. Like I feel like the Richie and Martin stuff, like you could almost remove that and that could almost be an entire feature unto itself, you know. I guess there's a few things like that in the show, but I don't know. Do you have anything that struck you?
Yes. So a lot of the stuff we were talking about with Richie being a Tory and Richie being repressed, Richie having shame, Richie in silence, this all to me connects to the big speech, talking of polemic speeches, talking of didactic speeches, the big one Jill has in episode 5 about her thesis of internalized shame and homophobia in households being such a huge driver of these men who get HIV, get AIDS, and they feel in some way they deserve it. I feel like we explore a lot of Richie's psychology that may support Jill's take there in this episode. Do you get where I'm coming from?
Reluctance to collaborate with like the activism and all that stuff speaks to that to a certain degree.
Yeah. Richie's desperation to deny his HIV and find harebrained ways to cure it. To me, that also reads sadder in light of his death in the finale, of course. And Ash's lovey-dovey scene with Richie also takes on greater meaning in light of how their would-be relationship develops in the finale. And I guess you can either read that as sad that their relationship never quite worked out time-wise, or you can read it as kind of sweet that they tried anyway and they got some kind of connected time like that together in the last episode. And Richie's lovely speech that ends this 4th episode, his declaration that he's going to live, I actually don't find that as sad in retrospect as those other things, because that speech shines a light on Richie's resilience, which we can then admire in the finale as he goes to really impressive lengths to fight his illness. So I don't get a misery-laden, oh, it's so sad that he said he's going to live when he in fact dies reaction from that. I get more of a, I really respect the resilience he displayed in that statement and how he followed through on that in the finale. I think that's an admirable part of his character.
Yeah.
I feel the behaviour of Richie's parents in the finale is foreshadowed here with how the dad behaves. He displaces his love of Richie onto his wife, saying it's Valerie, Richie's mother, that wants Richie to stay for dinner, to spend time with him. We know that Richie's dad in fact loves Richie very much, and from that exchange at the door about his supposed surprise at Richie being home, that Richie's dad, Clive, often masks things in how he talks to Richie. So I feel there's a foreshadowing of the finale here, in the dad kind of masking his love of Richie, and in the finale we see that love laid bare, and also in the dad displacing emotions onto his wife Valerie, which makes sense in terms of the finale, in terms of the relationship, and how she deals with the extraordinarily emotional circumstances with Richie. And okay, that does it for episode 4. Our next discussion will, of course, be on the very final episode. So a warm thank you to those listeners tuning in.
Thank you.